here at the Ministerial. Next, I'm going to introduce Jamie Love. He is with Knowledge Ecology International.
Thank you very much. I was going to talk briefly about the TRIPS issue. I think Sangeeta and other speakers, like from Brazil, sorry I'm late, but they did a great job of explaining where things stand right now. I will just add a couple points. The original proposal was to waive 40 articles in the WTO agreement on intellectual property rights, both in the sections that deal with the rights to be granted and the parts that have to do with the enforcement of those rights. The original proposal covered industrial designs, copyrights, the granting of patents, trade secrets, rights and data, a wide range of things. And the wide range was there because in the beginning, there were assertions, for example, on the development of respirators for using certain designs that would be protected under industrial designs or copyrights in some countries. There was the data and the know-how issues have been known. One of the arguments against doing anything on patents has always been, well, don't worry about patents because know-how and trade secrets are the real problem. But there's an article in the WTO that deals with trade secrets and know-how and data rights, and that's Article 39 of the TRIPS. So that was also part of the original waiver. If you fast forward right now, you have the waiver essentially focusing on a highly conditional waiver of 20 words in one article, just one paragraph in Article 31. So instead of 40 articles, you have one paragraph in one article, and that article is this issue of exports. And the article on trade secrets and on know-how, Article 39, what you have right now is they restate the existing flexibility in one paragraph of 3 in that article, and that's it. Even last week, there was a proposal to waive the whole article, which actually would have been useful. But in the current text, even that's not really, all you have is just a restatement of what you can already do. A lot of the so-called clarifications in the thing are just restatements of things you can already do. You don't have to have prior negotiation in an emergency like a pandemic like this. You don't have to do it. And there's these, as Sangeeta mentioned, there's these new obligations that kind of don't exist in the original TRIPS agreement. Like the U.S., for example, issued compulsory license to Moderna on this vaccine. Moderna is being sued by other third-party patent manufacturers. They have a very broad permission from the U.S. to use any patent by any money. They don't name the companies. They don't name the patent holders. They're just protected from all patent litigation. They didn't notify the WTO. They don't have these kind of restrictions that are in the other thing. So it's kind of a very differential thing. And then the last thing I'll mention is on the imports and exports. There are other ways you can already export in the WTO that don't have these severe, these are the most severe restrictions. So I'll just repeat that. You can export under Article 31K of the TRIPS without restriction of geographic area for either import or export. You can do the same thing under Article 30 if you do it, if you kind of know how to do it. You can do it under Article 44. You can do it under even Article 31 bis. It's restricted on geographic, but not as restrictive as this one is. This one's the most restrictive. You basically can only either import or export if you're a developing country minus China. So they exclude as markets all the companies that all the higher income countries, but also as suppliers. So the countries with a lot of capacity to export, like Korea, the United States. Germany, Belgium, Italy, UK, France, countries that have sort of historic China, that have historically been big suppliers of vaccine, they're all excluded. So what you got is the WTO putting forward an agreement for the most restrictive agreement in the history of the TRIPS agreement in terms of who can export vaccines in a pandemic. So this is like the World Trade Organization, right? So it's a shockingly inadequate proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. So we started with Switzerland. We've had voices from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from the Pacific Islands, from the US, the EU, and now we are going to come back to Switzerland. And I'd like to introduce our final speaker, which is Richard Hill with the Association for Proper Internet Governance, based here in Geneva.
I endorse everything that my colleagues said, and I'm going to comment on a different issue which was mentioned by Deborah in the beginning. Many of us registered for the ministerial, and we have badges, and so we should be able to walk into the building, and we had expected to do that today at the opening session. And just yesterday, we were notified that due to some unspecified security reasons, we could not go into the building anymore. Now, I'm Swiss. As I think many people know, Switzerland has a long tradition of consulting all facets of society, including civil society and even the citizens. We vote regularly in referendums. And I'm very shocked by this closure of the WTO to civil society. I don't know of any other international organization that is as close to civil society as WTO. Most UN organizations, in fact, all UN organizations, allow civil society as observers, sometimes even speaking observers. The WTO doesn't do that. They just have some sort of tolerance. Yeah, maybe sometimes we'll let you into the building. And of course, the lack of participation from civil society conditions the results and the outcomes, which, as we've just heard, really go against the interests of a great majority of citizens. And I'll just say another word about the moratorium. I find it amusing in a very negative way. It's kind of a sick joke, really, that Switzerland is strongly in favor of continuing the moratorium on e-customs duties, whereas we just voted both in Parliament and in a referendum approved by the people what everybody in Switzerland called the Netflix tax, which is not a customs duty, but in practice it is, because it only applies to entities that don't actually operate in Switzerland. So it's exactly equivalent to a tax. And during the debate, the issue was, well, should we tax those foreign streaming suppliers of video so that we could subsidize Swiss local production? And the resounding answer, both in Parliament and in front of the people, was yes. So given that, how can we with good faith say that other countries should not do similar things? Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to, if you'll allow me to clarify a little bit more the issue of the ministerial outcome document. That's where this issue of WTO reform is included. The reform that is being called for by many developed countries, and this is, you can see it in the briefing note that the Secretariat has put together. It's not actually included in the outcome document because they're trying to sneak it in and get a carte blanche for WTO reform negotiations, but what developed countries have been asking for is permanently abandoning the mandated, long unresolved issues of the development agenda, attacking developing countries' ability to access flexibilities enshrined in the WTO, without which they never would have allowed the WTO to come into existence, having a monitoring function in a way that would further constrain developing countries in using their development-oriented policy space, and many other issues. So we certainly reject this carte blanche for what is really not WTO reform. It's really a coup, because it's about giving more power to developed countries even than they already have, and giving more power to corporations. One of the provisions is also to allow new stakeholders. So I think you've heard from people now that we demand a public solution for a permanent solution for public stockholding in agriculture so that countries can provide food to their own citizens. We reject the current text, unfortunately, on fisheries. It would be great to have an outcome in that issue, but we need a pro-development outcome. And Pacific Islands are not going to pay the price for the overfishing of big fleets over decades. And unfortunately, after fighting so hard for so many months, most people here, I think, are calling for the rejection of the current counter-proposal on TRIPS. As we know, the waiver is not on the table, the counter-proposal is on the table, and we demand a comprehensive waiver. And we reject this false WTO reform, which is really about expanding the WTO and making it even more pro-corporate. So Please take time to interview or talk to some of the people here. It's sad, but it seems like any outcome this week will be portrayed as saving the WTO. They're trying to save it by destroying multilateralism, destroying consensus, and opening the way for plurilaterals, which doesn't make that much sense if plurilaterals are somehow saving the WTO. The outcome seems to be designed to boost the director's general reputation and less designed to actually help make the WTO more flexible for developing countries. And I'd just like to point your attention, if you haven't seen it before, to the turnaround statement, which calls for new multilateral trade rules for a people-centered shared prosperity and sustainable development, which is a platform endorsed by over 200 regional, national, and global civil society organizations around the world, which exposes the corporate-driven nature of the WTO and offers pathways forward for the fundamental transformation of the global trading system into one that would facilitate food security, jobs, access to medicines, and true sustainable development. So thank you, and I'd like to open the floor if there are any questions from the press or anyone else. Yes?
Philip, I'll just shout.
Okay.
Philip Blinkenson of Reuters. I won't shout then. Philip Blinkenson of Reuters. One of the things I just wanted to pick up on, I think it was Anna, you mentioned it more specifically, which was that basically the current IP waiver proposal actually has barriers in other words, it's worse than the current situation. So I wondered if you could kind of spell out what those barriers were, and then it's Adam, is that right? Right. Okay. Yeah. You were saying that. Hold on a second. Just go through my notes. Yeah. You were saying that the current text again, big fishing fleets are not targeted. Maybe you could just kind of clarify. I mean, obviously you mentioned clearly that small fishing nations or fishers are targeted, which obviously you don't want. But maybe you can kind of just clarify a little bit more about how the big fishers are not targeted.
Hi. So I think the benchmark is what we need for public health emergencies. I think COVID-19 is a health emergency like one we have not seen before. Huge social and economic devastation, the cost countries are paying, and the more vulnerable country you are, the higher the cost. And I think in that context, we have to see whether it delivers the tools we need to address a public health emergency, and it does not. It does not cover even the basic tools like therapeutics, diagnostics. There's no logic to excluding it. In terms of the existing flexibilities that we have and what we see in the decision, it adds several conditions that actually do not exist when you actually use compulsory licensing, which is what this decision is about, under the TRIPS agreement. For instance, it adds conditions of necessity tests, which under the WTO jurisprudence, actually, if you read paragraph 1 and footnote 2, there are 2 times necessary is mentioned and once required. And all of this imposes necessity tests, which under the WTO jurisprudence, we know it to be very difficult to satisfy. But under the TRIPS agreement, there is no such restriction. You do not have to prove anything is necessary to issue a compulsory license. And you can do it for any patents. And if you see footnote 2, the subject matter of a patent, there is an attempt to actually narrow the subject matter of a patent, and these are proposals by the UK and the Swiss. And then you have got conditions, if you see in paragraph 3B, 3B or 3C, I think it is 3C now, 3C, sorry, re-exportation. Paragraph on re-exportation, it prohibits re-exportation. What is the logic in preventing re-exportation during a health emergency? You want to ensure that there is re-exportation because that's the whole purpose and objective of the decision. And then there are obligations on notifications. Every action, it says any measure you need to notify. Again, this is not a requirement in the TRIPS agreement. So all of this is TRIPS plus.
I could add a point or two, but you want to respond? It is the most restrictive of anything that's been proposed to the WTO in terms of who can export. All of the other agreements allow anybody in the planet to export. This one restricts who can export to countries, most of which don't have the ability to export. And on the importing, it's also the most restrictive in terms of who the beneficiaries are, so it closes off the market. I just want to elaborate on the notification issue. There is an agreement that requires some notifications, a specialized one that was considered a failure, Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement. And we wouldn't be having this conversation about the current proposal that's on the table right now if that had worked. I mean, the 31 bis of the TRIPS was this thing that was agreed upon in 2003 to deal with this problem if you don't have manufacturing capacity, if you could export. It's been used once, and the country that used it said they'd never use it again. It was a Canadian company. And one of the problems are these issues of the notification. I'll explain briefly. If you go into a country and you try and get a compulsory license, and if it's under the health minister or even just the patent office, that could be really problematic. If you have to then get the foreign minister, the trade minister, the health minister, and the patent minister to all agree, and not only that, to notify the WTO and notify them like numerous times, like every time you do something on the production, every time you do that. And now they're supervising the remuneration issues, and they're tracking, whether not just the manufacture, the sale, and the export, but the re-exportation. Or do you have adequate measures on whether somebody buys it in your country and sells it in another country? I mean, there's like a whole series of things. Now, I think all these things are solvable, but they're new. And our experience is, in working with countries, every time you add a new speed bump, it has a much bigger impact than you might think.